All right, AP Environmental, we're going to continue today with our discussion about fossil fuels. So, we kind of touched a little bit on this the other day as far as, what fossil fuels are. We talked a lot about coal and how it's used to generate electricity. So we're going to talk a little bit more about coal today, some of the pros and cons with it, as well as we're going to get into some of the other fossil fuels as well. But this is going to take us into a whole other lecture as well on fossil fuels. So there's going to be three parts to this particular set of topics, 6.3 to 6.5. So again, the main forms of fossil fuels, we need to know this. Coal is one of them, which we've talked about, a little bit already. Petroleum, and we'll talk about that one today quite a bit. It's also known as crude oil. Natural gas, we'll get into that one a little bit later on this week. And then finally, oil shale or tar sands. We'll talk about that one a little bit today in the lecture. So let's kind of focus first on coal. One of the things about coal that I think is important that we know is, how does coal form? Basically, to just kind of make it real simple, coal is basically plants that lived when dinosaurs were here. That's what coal basically is. So think 300 million years ago, there were plants. When those plants died, they get buried in sediment and whatever, um, and eventually they turn into coal. Give me 10 seconds. I gotta let my dog out. Okay, sorry about that. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, coal is basically just the remnants of dead plants that were alive 300 million years ago, and now they're buried deep under the earth, and we can access that and we can use them for fuel. So just make sure we kind of know, just the general way that coal forms. There are sort of some different types of coal, and really they just vary depending on time and how much pressure they've been under over this amount of time. Just kind of going from left to right here, we have something called peat. Peat is basically baby coal. That's what it is. Think of it as baby coal. It really doesn't have too much energy value. It can be gathered and burned, but as far as producing, a lot of heat, it doesn't really produce very much. So it's not really something that we use globally as a major source of energy. But again, as we move to the right, we get into these other three forms of coal: lignite, bituminous coal, and then finally anthracite, which is also known as hard coal. And you'll see kind of the difference between these is, again, as you move to the right, the amount of heat that these forms of coal produce is much greater, and also the amount of carbon that's in that coal is much larger as well. All right, so here's kind of your three major forms of coal. Again, lignite, bituminous, and anthracite. One of the things about anthracite that I want us to kind of understand is that it is sort of like the best version of coal. It's kind of the one that produces the most energy. It also has the least amount of impurities in it, things like sulfur, for example. So it is kind of the preferred form of coal. The problem with it is we've mined so much of it that there really isn't very much anthracite left. All right, so anthracite is actually not very abundant because we've mined so much of it already. So that's kind of an issue. Bituminous coal is the most common. It's the one that there's a lot of deposits of it in the United States. We mine for it all the time. Uh, it does have a high heat content, kind of like anthracite, but it also has a lot more impurities. So we have to like remove a lot of those things, like sulfur, for example, before we burn it. That's one of the issues with bituminous. So I would definitely know these last two for sure. Lignite, and I wouldn't worry too much about that one, but the bituminous and anthracite, those are two kind of big ones. As far as where we find our coal, there are three countries around the world globally that are known as the top three coal producers, and that is the U.S., Russia, and China. I would know that. As far as the consumers of coal, China and the U.S., probably no surprise there, and also India. And really, these three countries here, the U.S. mainly because of our lifestyle, right? We rely on a lot of electricity, so we're going to burn a lot of coal. But China and India, it's mainly because of their population size. So that's one of the reasons why they're in the top three as far as consumers go. Advantages of coal. Why do we continue to use it? It is fairly easy to mine for, and it's fairly inexpensive compared to other things. So, I mean, again, that just kind of gets into the EROEI. We talked about that earlier, in a previous lecture. It is fairly easy to obtain. So that's one of the reasons why we use it. Um, we don't have to do very much to it before we actually burn it. I mean, there is refining involved, but it's not a real time extensive process. It's fairly easy to do compared to other substances. It's not as much refining. So again, it's cheap as well to do that. It's also real easily transported. I mean, just put it in a truck or put it on a train. You can move it from point A to point B. Hold on, gotta get my dog. All right, sorry about that. Disadvantages of coal. It's a non-renewable. That's probably a big disadvantage. I mean, this is something that we could run out of, right? It does take millions of years for coal to form, so that's kind of a big disadvantage. Environmental problems. We've talked about a lot of these already. We've got to remove overburden just to access the coal to get to it, to mine for it. Habitat fragmentation, all those problems with mining that we've talked about before. When you burn coal, lots of greenhouse gas emissions, and not only for example, when you burn it like to produce electricity, but also we burn it just in the transportation of coal, right? We're putting it in trucks and trains and moving it around, so we're burning a lot of greenhouse gases in that aspect. Water pollution. We've talked about chemical pollution. We've talked about thermal pollution, especially on the electricity end, the electricity production end of the process. And there's also a lot of solid waste that we have to deal with, a lot of coal ash. Here's a really good example of one of the big issues with the solid waste. This was in 2008. It happened in Tennessee. All of that solid ash, has to be put somewhere. So in Tennessee, they have these like big like retaining walls that like basically go around all the ash, and they just kind of hold it, store it in these certain areas. Well, one of those retaining walls broke, and all of this coal slag, all of this ash, actually went into a river, and over 1 billion gallons of ash got in there. The river flooded, and the results are basically what you see in this picture here. This picture in the upper right. This house. All this isn't mud. This is basically toxic waste. It's toxic coal ash that was just entered a river, and it just spilled over, and literally people were 6 7 feet high in this stuff. It was at the time, I believe it still is, it was the largest industrial spill in our country as far as a toxic waste spill. $1 billion to clean it up. So your tax dollars or your parents' tax dollars go to clean that up. There were no deaths in the initial spill, but there were 30 people who actually died just cleaning it up. Lung diseases, lung cancers, exposure to the toxins and the chemicals. So yeah, kind of a big nightmare there. This is another one, another big problem. This was in 2014. This happened in West Virginia. In this picture here, what you're seeing, these are the storage tanks which store the chemicals that are used to refine the coal. Well, in 2014, one of those tanks ruptured and broke. You'll notice right below it, there is a river called the Elk River. So all these chemicals spilled into the river. And I mean, this river is a source of drinking water for over 300,000 people. So they were without drinking water for weeks. That's a big problem. A lot of people got sick. The thing about some of these chemical incidents, like when there's spills in rivers and things like that, a lot of times you don't really know what the overall health impact is. I mean, because it could be a lingering thing that could last years and even decades, till we really find out what the magnitude is of some of these environmental problems. So, Elk River, West Virginia, that was kind of a big one as well. I might want to remember that one. All right, petroleum. Petroleum is another oops, sorry, is another fossil fuel, but this is a liquid fossil fuel. Coal is a solid, petroleum is a liquid. Now, how petroleum forms is kind of similar to coal, except for instead of just plants, it's actually dead plankton. Plankton are plants and animals. Again, think like dinosaur times, all the little plankton floating in the oceans. When those things die, they get buried in sediment and eventually they form oil or crude oil. Crude oil is basically unprocessed. It's unrefined. Once we process it and refine it, then we call it petroleum. But we're going to kind of use the same terms, crude oil and petroleum, kind of interchangeably, but they're basically the same thing. But petroleum has been a lot more refined. One of the big things with petroleum compared to coal is how we move it around. Coal, we mainly move it, through trains and trucks and maybe boats, but petroleum has to be drilled for. It has to be tapped into. It's a liquid, so we don't mine it like we do coal. And when we transport it, since it's a liquid, we have some different ways to move it around. There's pipelines, there's ocean tankers that can carry thousands and thousands of gallons of this stuff. And we can move it around with these types of trucks, these oil trucks, things like that. So it is transported a little bit differently. That does lead to some environmental issues. Oil shale. Oil shale is basically rock that has oil in it. Like this picture here that you're seeing, this is a piece of shale. And those kind of black stripes, that's the part of the rock that actually has the oil in it. We call that kerogen. It's basically rock that has oil like in it. The kind of lighter stripes, that's the rock that doesn't have the oil in it. So, I mean, in this big chunk here, there is oil that we can actually access and we can use. The good thing about oil shale is there is a lot of it, not only in the US, but even in other countries around the world. So there's an abundance of this stuff. So the disadvantage of it is, since it's kind of a rock, you do have to mine for it. So all those issues with pollution. And also to remove the oil from the actual rock, it's really difficult to do. You actually have to use oil to remove the oil. There's a lot of greenhouse gas emissions there. You also have to use a tremendous amount of water to remove that oil. So, again, we only have so much fresh water on the planet. We want to use it extracting oil, or do we want to use it to like drink and, irrigate crops with? So, I don't know. There's probably an issue there. Oil sands. Oil sands in this picture here, upper right, this is kind of what they look like. It's basically sand with water in it, or I should say with oil in it. The oil that is in oil sands is what we call bitumen. Bitumen is basically oil that's kind of been in this sand for a long time. It's been partially degraded, so it has to be processed. But the good thing, I guess, with oil sands is we have access to a lot of it. Up in Canada, one of our neighbors to the north, there is a tremendous amount of oil sand deposits in a place called Alberta, Canada. We'll talk more about Alberta in a second. But Alberta does tons of this stuff. So that's easy access for us if we want it, as long as we're friendly with Canada. Again, some of the issues with oil sands, it is kind of difficult to separate some of that oil. Again, we have to use a tremendous amount of water just to remove the oil from the soil. So that's kind of problematic. But again, we can get a lot of oil from oil sands. This is the Keystone Pipeline. It's been in the news a lot in the last several years. And you'll notice that the Keystone Pipeline originates up here in Alberta, Canada. And the red line is kind of showing you sort of the finished pipeline product that we already have. So, I mean, right now, this pipeline is carrying oil from the oil sands all the way down to Texas and even into Illinois. You see a picture of it here on the right. The reason why it's been in the news so much recently is because of a proposal. This kind of dotted line here. This is a proposal, kind of an extension of the pipeline. Um, and a lot of this has been a very political debate, between Republicans and Democrats for years. Should we build this? Should we continue building it? It seems like every time there's a change in president or a change in Congress, this pipeline either gets uh, it either gets backed by the politicians or it doesn't get backed by the politicians. So I mean, really, this has been going on for forever. I don't even know where we're at, as far as construction of it goes, but I do know in recently, since we've had a presidential change, I know that this pipeline, at least this extension, has been stopped. But who knows? In the future, that might continue. Now, I guess, some of the good and the bad with the Keystone Pipeline is the good. I suppose it does create jobs for U.S. workers, right? That's kind of a big deal, right? I mean, a lot of people work in the oil industry, and the construction of that pipeline is probably a good thing. Um, it's a very dependable source of oil. If we have that pipeline coming from Canada, then hey, as long as we're friendly with Canada, I guess we have a nice access to oil. The bad is, anytime you build a pipeline, it is going to fragment habitats. So fragmenting forests, things like that, it's not a good thing. It does increase our dependence on fossil fuels. So, I mean, if we have easy access to fossil fuels, that usually means that they're going to be cheaper. And that usually means that we're going to be dependent on it because we have easy access to it. And if we are dependent, that means that we're going to have more greenhouse gas emissions. So that is a whole new, problem altogether. Um, One of the other big deals with the Ogle or with the Keystone Pipeline. Time out. I got to get my pizza out of the oven. All right, sorry about that. I got a lot going on here today. Anyway, one of the other really bad um, parts about the pipeline is this very last one. I think this is kind of an interesting thing because if you go back to the map, if you look at this extension, okay, you can see kind of where this cuts through, right? Nebraska, Kansas, the Dakotas. You guys might remember in the last unit we talked about the Ogallala Aquifer. So this extension of the pipeline actually travels right over the top of it. So, like, what would happen if that pipeline broke and like millions of gallons of oil like got into the soil and got into the aquifer? And remember, that's one of the biggest aquifers in our country. So that's a major source of drinking water. So, I mean, we're kind of playing with fire there if we're going to build a pipeline over the top of a major aquifer. All right, another problem with the Keystone Pipeline, this is one of the reasons why it's been in the news so much recently, is that extension of the pipeline is going to be built over a lot of Native American land, South Dakota, North Dakota. And this is land that, our country basically said, hey, the Native Americans, this is your land. We're not going to intervene. We're not going to do anything to this land. This is yours. And now we're saying that we're going to build a pipeline over this land that we gave them like hundreds of years ago. So, I mean, there's been a lot of conflict between certain groups of people just because of the proposal here of this particular pipeline. So, make sure we know some of the pros and cons of that. This is another, kind of highly debated thing. It's called ANWR. ANWR stands for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. You'll notice here it's kind of this area in yellow, kind of in northeastern Alaska here. You see this piece of land, and next to it they have a kind of a picture of the state of North Carolina, or I should say South Carolina. So you can kind of see how big this is. I mean, this area of Alaska is as big as the state of South Carolina. Now, the reason why it's been in the news is because there's a region of this wildlife refuge, and this is protected land here. There's a reason or a region called the 1002. Now, the 1002 is an area of the refuge that contains a lot of oil. There's over 10 billion barrels of oil that can be accessed from that area. So, you can imagine, why that area might be really important to people because we can drill for that oil. This black line here, this is the Alaskan pipeline. So they're proposing maybe building a pipeline here to, kind of extend into the Alaskan pipeline. But again, if they do that, this wildlife refuge, this is an area where there's a lot of endangered species and threatened species, things like polar bears and caribou. This is where they mate and where they breed, and this could really propose some major issues with their habitat. So, should we drill up there? Should we not? Um, kind of depends on what stance you want to take on it, I suppose. All right. Now, when it comes to petroleum, like what do we use this for? We use petroleum for a lot of things. There are over 150 different oil refineries in the U.S., and every single one of them, and one of them is over here in Whiting, right, the BP oil refinery. Every single one of them is taking crude oil and basically making other products from that oil. Really, what these oil refineries do is they basically just take crude oil, okay, and they just heat it to different boiling points. And when they heat it to different boiling points, they can produce different things like gasoline for cars or jet fuel or diesel fuel, whatever. So this is kind of what these refineries do is they're making all of these different products from crude oil. So, like, if you think crude oil, like the only thing you can make from it is like motor oil, that's incorrect. You can make. I mean, there's things, for example, back to this picture. I mean, like for example, M&Ms or like gummy bears. I mean, there are petroleum products in some of the foods that we eat. Vaseline. It's also called petroleum jelly. I mean, it's used for a variety of things, right? I mean, all of these things, I mean, are all products that we get from crude oil. It just has to be refined in order to produce those things. So as far as using petroleum, there's 7 countries around the world that basically use over half the world's petroleum. The top three, Saudi Arabia, Russia, the U.S. These 3 countries produce a ton of oil, a ton of petroleum. The U.S. by far, uses more petroleum than any other fuel source. That's probably because of our transportation methods, right? I mean, we use 22% of the world's petroleum. That's almost a quarter of all the petroleum in the world is used right here in the U.S. And we have to get that from somewhere. We can get some of it from here, right? Some of that petroleum we can get from our own country, but we do have to import a lot of it. And a lot of it comes from the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, and also Russia. I do want you to know this. This is the top oil producing states in our country. This was leased back in 2016, but this hasn't changed. Number one is Texas. Texas is a huge oil producing state. North Dakota, a lot of people may not know that, but it is. California is another one. Alaska is number four. Oklahoma is number five. All right, so five major crude oil producing states in our country. There are other states as well, but these are the big five. At the very bottom here, though, it does mention federal offshore Gulf of Mexico. So, like this is the Gulf of Mexico down here. So we're talking Florida Panhandle, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi. This area right in here, there is a ton of offshore drilling. If you've ever been to the Florida Panhandle and been to the Gulf of Mexico, you may have seen like really big tankers out in the middle of the Gulf. Those big oil platforms, those are pumping a lot of crude oil from the ocean. If we could count that as a state, that would actually be number two. But we don't consider that because it is offshore. It's not like part of the continental United States or anything, or just the United States in general. But there's a lot of drilling that goes offshore, especially right down here in the Gulf of Mexico. All right, advantages of petroleum: easy to transport. It does burn cleaner than coal. So it does actually produce less carbon dioxide when it's burned compared to coal. So I guess that's an advantage. It also is ideal for transportation purposes. So cars and planes, anytime we need to get from point A to point B, we use gasoline. Well, that is a product of petroleum. So that's a big advantage there. Some disadvantages: lots of impurities in petroleum. So when we burn it, even though there may not be a lot of CO2, which there is some, but there's other things like sulfur and lead and arsenic and mercury, and those things can cause air pollution, so that's not a good thing. A lot of land runoff. This picture on the right here, for example, this is oil, right, that's spilled out of someone's car. Just collects on the pavement or the asphalt. But if it rains or something, that can run off, into lakes, rivers, or the ocean. So that's a big problem. And then, of course, we have drilling and transportation problems. There have been some of the biggest environmental um, catastrophes in the history of the world that have been associated with transporting or drilling of oil. Two that you need to know. All right, one of them is the Exxon Valdez. This happened in 1989. Yours truly was a senior in high school when this happened. But this was an oil tanker up in Alaska that basically ran up a little bit too close to shore, hit some rocks, and millions of gallons of oil spilled into the Alaskan waters off the shores or off the coast of Alaska. This was a major environmental damage, millions and millions of gallons of oil. I mean, the cleanup was just unbelievable. The amount of money that had to be spent on it. I'm going to have a little video in the Buzz Agenda for you guys to watch about this. But this was, again, one of the biggest environmental disasters we have ever seen, not only in this country, but around the world. One of the ones that was a little bit more recent, this happened in 2010. This was the Deepwater Horizon. This happened down in the Gulf of Mexico off the coast of Louisiana, I believe. The Deepwater Horizon was an oil platform. They drill for oil. There was an explosion on the platform, and again, millions of gallons of oil spilled into the ocean, washed up on shore. It took weeks to stop the flow of oil into the ocean. So again, the environmental catastrophe that this was is kind of unmeasured. Again, billions of dollars to clean up. BP, the oil company, was found responsible for this, and they had to clean up the mess. And we will watch a film about this year. One of the few movies that I show in class. It's called Deepwater Horizon. It stars Mark Wahlberg and some other guys. Kurt Russell, I think, is in it. But it basically is a pretty good recreation of what actually happened aboard the Deepwater Horizon and like the magnitude of this environmental disaster. So we will watch that soon. All right, guys, have a good day. I will see you soon. We'll do part 3 during our next lecture. Take care, everybody.